Hello everyone and welcome to the Age Group Triathlon Podcast. My name is Simon Olney, I'm a professional triathlon coach, and in this week's episode I'm going to be talking you through the first episode of a 3-part series looking at strength and conditioning. Now before you hit that skip episode button, before you think no it's not for me strength and conditioning, it doesn't work, I don't see the point, please just give me 10, maybe 15 minutes of your time just to listen to the start of this episode and see why if we can start to understand why it is that people do it. Because the fact of the matter is that when you're on race day and these people go past you like you're standing still and you think, why are they so much faster than me? What am I doing wrong? How can I get faster than them? I guarantee that those athletes who are that bit faster than you have been hitting their strength and conditioning sessions. Now, before we get stuck into this, I did just want to highlight that I'm running a webinar on the 11th of October 2025 at 7 p.m. UK time, where I'm going to be talking you through how to become an Ironman in 2026. So if you are looking at completing an Ironman next year, or you're even just sort of thinking about it, wondering what it may involve, jump down to the show notes, follow that, sign up for the webinar. And I will, over the course of an hour, help talk you through everything you realistically need to know to get started with your Ironman training. Moving on to the matter at hand, we are going to break down the various different benefits that strength and conditioning has to an athlete's performance. Now, the first and most obvious benefit that strength has to someone's performance is that, well, it allows us to be able to push more water back with each stroke, push each pedal stroke down harder, push off of the floor with more force when we're running. Okay, each of these are useful. They're definitely helpful. I mean, if you look at the sort of top-end track cyclists, the ones who are creating huge amounts of power, they spend as much time in the gym as they do on the velodrome and just sort of training. Because of how important it is for them to create that absolute power. Now, for triathletes, it's not quite as important in that respect. Let's be honest. Yes, if somebody goes to the gym and they do, a nice big strength of block of strength training, then they might improve their FTP by sort of 3 or 4 watts or something. It will be especially notable on the hills. But the actual real benefits of it, we're not going to suddenly see our numbers skyrocket as soon as we start lifting. That's just not the way it works. It is much more sort of a long game, and you will see greater improvements over time as you continue strength training for sort of weeks, months, years into the future. But in the immediate, don't expect to see a huge benefit. But I would say that for the most part, this element of simply kind of increasing output through strength training on its own, it doesn't really justify time spent in the gym. The biggest benefit for triathletes is its ability to reduce injury. And as we're triathletes, we tend to spend all of our time going forwards. We're swimming forwards, we're cycling forwards, we're running forwards. Apart from making a 180-degree turn sometimes when we're running on the course, turning around a buoy, we don't tend to do anything that is in anything other than that plane of movement. Whereas when you look at a lot of athletes, they spend more time moving laterally, so side to side, especially in team sports, and in that rotational plane. It doesn't come up so much in other sports, but it's definitely there. And as triathletes, if we're only ever training our body to go forwards, then we're not going to be hitting the muscle groups that allow us to go from side to side. But you can understand people going, well, hang on a minute. If our body isn't moving on that side-to-side lateral plane, why is it that we need to train the muscles there? Now, when I'm talking about injury here, I'm going to be speaking in very, very broad strokes. I do not want you to go away from this and go, oh, that's the cause of my injury and this is how I fix it. I'm not a physiotherapist. I'm a strength coach. I can understand common weaknesses and how they impact somebody's ability to be injury free, but it has to be said that you really, if you are suffering with pain, you do need to see a physiotherapist. But what I'm able to explain to you today is how training in certain patterns, certain muscles in certain ways can help reduce our risk of injury. And on the subject of moving laterally side to side, the muscle that controls the movement of our knee and our leg as we go side to side It's a little muscle that is sat in your bum on the side, and it's called the glute medius. And this muscle is an absolute pain, literally, in the backside for a lot of runners, because if that muscle is weak, if it's underdeveloped, then, or even if it's especially tight, then it's going to impact our body's ability to be able to control the movement of our legs from side to side. Now, have you ever run behind someone and you notice, or even cycled behind someone, and you notice that their knees are constantly dipping in towards the centre line of their body? Rather than staying in line with their feet and their hips, their knees bow inwards with each step. This is really, really common in people who don't do strength training. And they will sort of probably, over time, if they continue running like that, develop something known as IT band syndrome. The IT band is short for the iliotibial, I want to say. I haven't got the word in front of me. I believe it's that band which runs down the side of your leg. And it is, I believe, the biggest tendon in your body. And it runs from your hip down to the outside of your knee. And if your knee keeps swinging into the centre line of your body, that keeps pulling on this tendon. Now, tendons, despite what you may think and feel, are incredibly strong and incredibly resilient. It takes an awful lot to get to the point where they really get upset by being pulled tight. But if we're looking at tens of thousands of steps with very poor sort of control over our knee, then that is going to agitate the IT band because it's attached to the knee. The IT band's job is to keep everything in place there. And so the IT band there then gets pulled tight, which results in pain on the outside of your knee. Now, this is a slight oversimplification. And just if somebody is suffering with an IT band issue, that does not necessarily mean the glute medius itself is the issue, because everything is connected. It could be that it's an issue from somewhere else in their body that's representing as pain in the outside of the knee. But you get the idea, how muscles that we don't target normally from just sort of running forwards actually are quite critical to us be able to continue running forwards. And the way that we develop and train that glute medius is with lateral movements. So you might have seen people with resistance bands, putting them around their ankles, and they walk sideways like a crab. Or it could be that they sort of stick wrap something sort of attached to a cable machine around their ankle, and then they lift their leg away and they train it that way. Okay, there are lots of movements that we can do to target this, but the fact of the matter is, no matter how much you run, you are never going to end up targeting that muscle simply from running. Now, you may have seen various people do sort of the exercise clamshells as well, where they lie on their side and then they take one leg, the leg that's sort of on top, as it were, and they lift it away from their body. It's often given to people when they're recovering from sort of surgery or sort of general physio. This exercise, I mean, yes, it will strengthen our glute medius, but probably not to the extent that we need as athletes. You know, for general population, people are just inherently very weak. Yes, that may end up helping, but as athletes, we probably need something a bit more sort of serious. We need a bit more of a stimulus to actually strengthen that muscle. If we just did standard clamshells all day, we probably wouldn't make that much of a difference at all. What we can do is we could use a resistance band, wrap that around our knees, and then suddenly we're really working against something. We're really waking that muscle up. Or you could do it with a resistance band and then hold it for 20-30 seconds in that position. That's going to get a right old burn on you, I promise. There is a lot that we can do to advance these exercises, but it's worth considering, rather than just looking at exercises that your aunt was given after she had sort of a surgery or an injury or something. We do need to be thinking like athletes here, and really looking at exercises which are going to challenge us and we are going to sort of really feel the impact of. Now, the example that I used there of the glute medius and IT band syndrome, it's a very common issue that athletes suffer with, and it's a very common injury for runners to develop. And lo and behold, when they start to introduce some of this work into their training, it tends to go away. However, just about every running injury that somebody can pick up could have prevented is a strong word. I don't like the term injury prevention, because we cannot prevent injuries. If that was true, then no professional athletes who work with strength and conditioning coaches would ever get injured. But we all know that being injured is just sort of part of being an athlete, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't the case. I wish I could say, oh, I'll sprinkle this fairy dust over you, give you the perfect strength and conditioning plan, you'll never be injured again. It just doesn't work like that. However, most injuries that athletes pick up, could have at least been reduced if they had increased their sort of compliance with strength and conditioning, basically. Now, if you get an injury from falling off your bike, then yeah, I'm afraid there's not an enormous amount that I could do to help you there. However, even if somebody falls over when running, there is a chance that strength and conditioning could have prevented that. Perhaps by giving us stronger adductors and abductors around our hips to be able to allow ourselves to stabilise quicker and more strongly. Whether it is that we weren't picking our feet up off the ground enough and we were sort of shuffling along or we tripped over something. The benefits of strength and conditioning to injury sort of reduction are absolutely massive. Now, some people will turn around and they'll say to me, yes, but Simon, show me the science, show me the studies that show that strength training reduces injuries by this amount. And the fact is, there aren't that many studies out there that paint it in a really clear picture that this is what helps. But think about it this way. Some things, if you listen to my episode about the scientific method that I released a few months ago, it might help you understand. But just because something hasn't been proven with a study doesn't necessarily mean that's not the case. Some things can never really be explained by study. But think about it this way. If you go to the physio and you say, oh, I've got this pain in my knee, and they go, all right, let's have a look at you. They do movement screening and they go, yeah, you've got tightness here, or oh yes, you've got weakness here. Oh, this muscle group isn't working as it should be. What do they do to give you to help with this? They give you exercises. And these are generally exercises targeting muscle groups that if you had been on top of your strength and conditioning with those muscle groups, you might not have actually got injured. Now again, there's never any guarantees with this, but quite often muscle groups which tend to be weak, which tend to be tight, tend to be underactive, your hamstrings, your glutes, your hips, calves, these are all, prime suspects for running injury. If you kept on top of these with strength and conditioning, which can be as little as 45 minutes a week, you could have reduced the chance of you not only missing out on training, also not having to spend a lot of money on physiotherapy. I mean, these days you're looking at sort of £150 or something normally for a initial consultation with a physio to give you a look over and to give you a diagnosis. And then any other sort of treatment that you might have, any race entries that you paid for that you now can't enter. Injury can be really financially expensive, as well as absolutely devastating mentally. Having lost that outlet, the effect it can have on an athlete's mental health, it is horrible. I genuinely wouldn't wish a running injury or triathlon injury on my worst enemy, because I know just how much it can sort of knock you off of your feet as an athlete. And there are a number of people who they really fall in love with running or triathlon or the sport. They get an injury and the physio goes, okay, well, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem, because they skip the strength work. And they never get back to where they were, and they end up leaving the sport, and they spend a lot, the next few years talking about how bitter they are about an injury that, kicked them out of the sport. Again, there's never any guarantee that you can sort of prevent this altogether, but strength and conditioning can stop you being sort of a statistic in this area, as it were. Next benefit of strength and conditioning is your neuromuscular system. So this sounds really scary, but it's not. So basically, it's how your nervous system talks to your muscles. So when the brain sends a signal to a muscle, and it goes, I want to move this leg forwards, then the signal gets sent from your brain down your spinal cord, down to what we call your peripheral nervous system, and then that then reaches the muscle. And then when the nerves reach the muscle, then they fire what's called a number of motor units. Now, let's imagine that we're talking about our quadriceps here. Those are the muscles that are on the front of your leg. If we are firing up our quads, let's say that our quads have 100 motor units in them. This is where the nerves meet the muscles, and these are points where we can wake up and use the muscle. And if somebody has spent the last sort of 20 years sat behind a desk and they decide that they're going to start triathlon, they start running. But the nervous system hasn't used the quads to their to the most of their ability, let's say, for the last sort of 15, 20 years. Now, the result of this is that a lot of the motor units have switched off. The brain has thought, well, you know what, we don't actually really need to use these parts of the muscle. We don't need to recruit as much of that muscle, because all we're doing is getting up from a chair and then taking the lift downstairs and walking to the car. You know, our muscles aren't really being used, so we don't need to maintain these pathways. Then, if I were to take an athlete who is a desk-based athlete, and we include a strength and conditioning program, and over time, again, this is not the kind of training you can rush into. Over time, we start including more in the way of explosive movements. So these could be hops, jumps, leaps, something like that. Something that's explosive, okay? And we are really asking our body to use the muscle in a very sort of dynamic way. Suddenly, the body starts opening up these long forgotten pathways. You go, oh crikey, I haven't had to do this for a long time. Okay, let's start and engage more of this muscle. And the same can also happen if you are lifting heavy weights. So if I get into this in episode 3 of this series, but if you are sort of lifting a light weight repeatedly, it's fine. It's better than nothing, especially if it's targeting muscles that we can't target with more sort of traditional movements. But let's be honest, you know, it's what we really need if we want to sort of wake these muscles up is to lift with heavy weights. And if we are either doing explosive movements or we're lifting really heavy weights, suddenly we're really asking our muscles to do what they were designed for, okay? Which is to be sort of real prime movers, to move in an explosive fashion, to move in a dynamic fashion. And we just cannot create this stimulus from running or from cycling or from swimming. You know, the ability of us to forge these new connections between our brain and our muscle. And you may think, okay, Simon, well, that's all well and good. But when I'm doing my triathlon training, I'm not jumping on boxes. I'm not leaping. I'm running. I'm cycling. I'm swimming. Yeah, that's totally the point. But if we wake up these pathways to our muscles, if we then have more motor units that are awake, more nerves sending signals to that muscles, that allows us to use more of that muscle during the rest of our training. And suddenly, instead of only using a small percentage of that muscle, if we include strength and conditioning, if we include neuromuscular exercise within our training, suddenly these connections are being made in our muscles to our brain, and the brain's go, oh, this is great. I've unlocked all of this strength that I'd kind of forgotten that I had. I'm not going to pretend that this will double your FTP or give you any, huge benefits here. But the fact of the matter is that there is an enormous amount that can be achieved simply by doing some explosive training, doing some heavy lifting, and really reminding our body how it is that those muscles are designed to be used. Now, including strength and conditioning in our training is also going to help us improve our technical abilities. Now, some people may think, how on earth is lifting weights in the gym going to help my swimming technique or my running form? And I'm going to use a couple of examples here. In the first example, I'm going to talk about shoulder mobility within swimming. Now, mobility is different to flexibility, where flexibility is the ability of a single muscle to be able to stretch, which again is not, unimportant, but I think mobility is very underrated. It's the sort of the less sexy version of flexibility. If you, for example, were to take your hand and lift it above your head. Okay? How easy does that feel? Now, for some people, they'll be able to do that effortlessly. I just did that right now when I was explaining it to you. And to me, it felt fine because I have good levels of mobility in my shoulder joint. For some people, however, they're not going to be able to get it over their head without it feeling sort of tight and painful. And some people, they're going to really struggle actually to get their hand above their head anyway. Now think about our swimming technique. Where is it that our hand ends up as it enters the water? Well, it ends up in that exact same position. And when we're doing strength work, we're not only looking at sort of strength and conditioning, I should say, but when we're doing this work, we are not simply focusing on getting stronger. We're also looking on getting more mobile. So that is increasing the range of motion in our joints. And the way that we can do this is with exercises that we can include in our program that will improve our body's ability to be able to to stay in those uncomfortable positions over a prolonged period of time. Now, this can be affected by flexibility. Absolutely. Flexibility and mobility, they are two sides of the same coin, really. It could be that somebody's mobility is actually restricted by a lack of flexibility in a certain muscle. But if you look at a lot of bodybuilders in the gym, there's that that stereotype, as it were, is that really big, strong guy that can't lift his arms higher than his shoulders. He's just built up so much muscle in the wrong places. It's not overly uncommon, and these are people who prioritize like pure strength and muscle size over mobility. As we get older as well, our mobility decreases. It's just as we start to lose muscle mass, things will start to tighten up a little bit. If we include strength and conditioning in our training, then it's going to allow us to enjoy that improved range of mobility for longer through life. I'm not saying that strength and conditioning is the fountain of youth, but it's about the closest thing that we have to the fountain of youth. The ability to be able to sticking with that example, to get your arm directly above your head without any major restriction, it's incredibly important in swimming, but it also has knock-on effects to the rest of our life. Now you may go, okay, Simon, so what kind of mobility exercises can I be doing? And well, it's a very difficult question to answer because there are so many different exercises that we could do. But one sort of exercise that a lot of people can do as a bit of a mobility test, as it were, is to stand. Assuming you're familiar with a basic squat pattern, if not, Google it. Stand, do a squat with your arms by your sides, and then your legs at about shoulder widths apart. Do a squat down with your arms out in front of you, if that helps, and notice what it is that your heels do as you squat down. If your heels rise off the floor, that's a sign that we have restricted ankle mobility. If your knees buckle in, that means that your glute medius likely needs a little bit of attention there. Now, there are lots of other cues that we can pick up on. Those are just a couple. Now do the same thing again with your hands above your head. And notice how your body might start to squirm, to struggle. Try to keep the arms, above your head without them falling forwards. And notice that what actually sounds like a relatively basic exercise to do could actually give you a real insight into issues with your body. Now, it should go without saying that somebody who has fantastic level of flexibility and mobility in their shoulders will be a better swimmer than somebody who is incredibly tight and rigid in their stroke. And you can do all of the swimming drills in the world. You can go to all the coach sessions in the world. You can buy all the swim toys. You can do all of the online courses to help you with your swim technique. But unless you have nice mobile shoulders, you're never going to have that beautiful buttery smooth technique that you see the instructors using. And a lot of the reason that people don't sort of touch on this is because at the end of the day, it's kind of outside of a lot of people's lane. I went and I trained specifically as a strength and conditioning coach, so that I could help people, help athletes with this element of their training. A lot of coaches, they simply don't, and that's not me, knocking chunks off of them. A lot of people, I mean, if you are a club swimmer and you have all these athletes that you're coaching, it's not really your job to give them individual strength and conditioning plans. You might want to get an expert into the club to do some training with them and do some assessments. That's something they could do. But a lot of coaches, they just don't have the skills and the understanding to really be able to to coach this effectively, which is, where people such as myself come in, who tries to take a little bit of a wider view of performance rather than focusing on single aspects. And it doesn't help that a lot of coaches are used to coaching younger people who have much less in the way of issues in these areas than others, but we'll get onto that in a bit more detail later. So the second example that I wanted to look at how strength and conditioning improves your technical abilities is on the run. And if we think about how somebody runs, it is a unilateral exercise, so we are using one limb at a time. At no point are both of our feet on the floor, which is bilateral. We've always got one foot in the air, one foot on the floor. And as a result, that leg that is in contact with the floor has quite a lot of work to do, because not only does it have to generate propulsion and force by pushing off the ground, it also needs to ensure that it's nice and stable and strong. And if we look at our example that we had earlier of our our runner with the knees that buckle in towards their centre line with every step, that's going to have a very notable ability on somebody's running economy. If you were to look at, if you were to run behind two runners, one that has a very solid straight knee drive and one who has one that rocks around, guess which one is going to be more efficient? Guess which one is going to use less energy and probably be the faster runner, assuming they both had a similar level of aerobic fitness. But it extends beyond that as well. It looks at all of the muscles that are used within the actual propulsion itself. So if we look at the prime movers with our running, if we look at our glutes, if we look at our hamstrings, if we look at our quads and our calves, these are really the biggest muscles that influence our running speed. These can all, ironically, be targeted with the lunge. So this is a fantastic exercise for runners to do. You can do a bodyweight lunge, you can do a walking lunge, you can do a reverse lunge, dumbbell lunge, you can do a barbell lunge. There's a lot that can be done with this exercise. And bang for buck, if you were only including one exercise in your strength routine, I think I'd probably choose the lunge, from a performance aspect at least. Now, if these prime movers are strong, that allows us to, push off the ground with more effort, which is great. But it also allows us, as we land, that our stronger muscles, they can act, if you ever heard somebody talk about leg spring stiffness, they store energy potential in them, a bit like springs. Okay. Now, if you think about a really strong spring, the amount of energy that can store in it, as opposed to a very kind of weak, loose spring that you have. And this can really be the difference between when you see runners who are running along at high speed and they are poetry in motion. You can see they're just flowing extremely nicely as they move, as opposed to somebody who's running along and it's kind of 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 4 step. That is a huge issue. And as well, if we think about running technique, let's think beyond the legs. Let's think about the core. Let's think about all of the muscles in our upper body, in our abdominals. We've all seen runners who, I think, it's probably not cruel to say, are probably quite new to running, who are running along down the road and their whole body is swaying and twisting as they're doing so. And you can see they're just wasting a huge amount of energy because their body is unable to hold itself tall and straight and be efficient. if you look at the very best runners, if you look at, sort of track athletes are often a fantastic example of this. Professional triathletes at the end of an Ironman marathon probably aren't really the where we should be looking at for sort of optimal running form. But if you look at track athletes, look at how planted they are, look at how strong they are, that is the kind of strength that can only really be created sort of outside of running. Again, as we run, yes, we will start to slowly develop strength in those areas because the body is quite literally keeping itself nice and strong and stable as it runs. But there is nothing quite like doing core exercises for us improving that efficiency. So between having improved leg spring stiffness, between the stronger muscles acting to sort of hold their energy potential in our legs and it help propel us off the ground with each step, in addition to us not sort of twisting around as we're running, these are going to have huge impacts to our running technique, to our efficiency. The next benefit we gain is coordination and balance. Now, a lot of triathletes, if you were to ask them to balance on one leg, they'd squirm around and fall over. Especially sort of longer course triathletes who focus very much, as they should, on time spent on their feet. If we include strength training in our regime, then we have improved coordination, just sort of generally in all areas of life, but especially when we're looking at sort of lower leg balance, which when you think about it, if we are running, if we are going to be spending a lot of time on one foot, then having improved balance is actually really going to help us. And this kind of work that we include, it's the difference between, if we sort of use the example of an Olympic diver who does a sort of a dive with a series of twists and flips and hits the water beautifully, as opposed to your mate Brian from down the pub having a crack. It's that awareness, that coordination, and also sort of that spatial awareness that we develop with these advanced exercises that can really help us just become sort of more athletic, have that more sort of explosivity in our training, and just end up, sort of getting some of that sort of youthful vigour back. That, if you look at children, running around playing, they are great. They're running, they're jumping, they're throwing, they're doing all these exercises that their body was meant to do. But then as we get older, we start to lose this. But if we can start to include some of this in our gym training, it's going to have a real knock-on effect to our performance as triathletes. Now, strength training, especially sort of advanced strength training, is really essential if you are the kind of athlete who describes themselves as being a plodder. Oh, I like long distance. I'm not fast, I just like to keep going. I can keep going all day. And you know what? I think there are some people who are genuinely really happy to be this person. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're happy knocking out a series of 15, 16 hour Ironmans and just enjoy travelling around the world and ticking these events off, look, I'm not going to try and tell you you're doing it wrong. But there are a lot of people, I think, who talk about, I'm slow, I just keep, chipping away at it, who say they're fine with it, but deep down, they want to get faster. They're not sure why it is that they can't find this extra gear. And the key to this, to developing this, to gaining more gears, does lie within, not only the intervals that you choose in your training, but also strength training. When we go back to that neuromuscular recruitment, that's a big part of it. If someone is only ever using a small percentage of their leg muscles, they're never actually really going to get all that faster. As opposed to someone who has a sort of a very involved strength program that will help them develop that extra power, that will help them be able to sort of take, hours off of their Ironman time if they commit to it. A lot of people don't want to commit to it, and that's fine. But as we get older, we encounter a condition known as sarcopenia, which is where we lose muscle mass as we get older. And unless we offset this with strength training, then this is going to have a real impact on our times. And we cannot completely offset, sarcopenia. You will see some people who look very muscular in their 50s, 60s, 70s, but I think we all know that's not entirely natural. However, we can go a long way to be able to increase our sort of time that we can spend as triathletes enjoying our training and enjoying our racing by introducing strength training. And funnily enough, I think the group that are really on point with their strength training are more those in their 40s and 50s who have gone, look, it's incredibly important as I get older that I keep doing this if I want to stay in the sport. Like, imagine if I'd included this when I was younger, like how much faster I could have raced in my prime. And I think the final benefit doesn't involve triathlon. It just involves you being a more confident, more useful human being. If you are able to just sort of, oh yes, I'll pick that up for you, I'll help you with that, I'll hold that, I'll undo that, whatever the job is, to be able to, to be able to pick up, like yesterday, I was digging a pond in a garden. I was just able to sort of to keep going with my spade while everyone else was sort of having to take breaks. It just helps set you up for, just being that, a bit more useful in these situations. But more than that, as people start to get older, a lot of the reasons that older people will go to personal trainers is because they've got grandchildren and they have the grandchildren over and they can't keep up with them. They can't get down on the floor to play with them and they can't then get back up off the floor. They have to ask their partner to help them off the floor after they've finished playing with the children. And that's something that really takes a lot of people by surprise, because they think to themselves, "Oh, I've still got it. I can still do all this." And then the time comes to actually use these skills, and they realise that because they haven't used it, they've lost it. And it's just incredibly important for like a quality of life perspective to include some strength work. It also helps reduce the risk of osteoporosis, which is especially important for sort of menopausal, perimenopausal women. It helps offset a huge range of sort of health conditions as well. Strength training, there's a reason that people talk about it so much for longevity. There's a reason that you see so many people in their 50s, 60s and 70s in the gym. It's because of how important it is, and it goes beyond bodybuilding. It goes beyond strength just for muscle size. It really is about maintaining your independence, maintaining your dignity as we all get older. Now, some of you will hear this and you go, Simon, it all sounds great. But, and there's always a but. So I'm going to sort of finish the episode off by looking at some common objections that people have to strength training. And I'm going to break them down one by one. Some of them are very legitimate. Some of them are people just trying to tell themselves that it's not right for them. But we'll break it down and we'll sort of find some sort of different coping strategies that will help us. Now, the first one is I don't have time. And this is a tale as old as time in itself. I've got all these sessions that I need to do for my training. I can't fit in strength work. Now, I think strength work, most athletes, most of the year, don't need more than 1 or 2 sessions a week, which could only end up being 45 minutes. And it's really not an enormous amount of time that you need to dedicate to it. I'm not going, okay, you need to get down the gym 3-4 times a week. You need to be grinding away for 90 minutes and then you'll be able to prevent injury. Like, that is not the way to sell it, okay? That is not what triathletes are asking for. I think what makes me different as a strength coach is that I am a triathlete first and foremost. I am a triathlon strength coach who builds strength programs around the training that people are doing. Now, as we come into the off season, this is a great time to focus on strength training because our training volumes are lower. Our training intensity is lower, and we can do 1 or 2 strength sessions a week without it having a real impact on our training. A lot of people's sort of first experience with strength training will be as they're building up to a race and they're trying to find all the possible areas they can improve, and they find, oh, I can start to do strength work. That's meant to be good, and they'll do strength work and they won't really see much of a benefit in it. It will make them sore. And they go, no, it's rubbish, and they'll dismiss it out of hand, which may be sort of your experience with it or people that you know. And that really doesn't sort of set us up for success trying to integrate strength work at that point in time. It's much, much better to do it in the off season, to at least start in the off season. And again, it only needs to be, 45 minutes a week. If you should do one session, that's a lot better than doing no sessions. Now, there may be some of you go, look, Simon, my calendar is booked out throughout the entire day. I have an hour for training, and that's all I can manage. I just can't do any more than that. You go, okay, well, I get that. Have we considered introducing some exercises just sort of throughout the day? Could you do calf raises while you're on a call? Could you do some press-ups, at different points in the day whilst waiting for the kettle to boil? There are all these different ways for us to fit movements within our day that will help us. Do some lunges, do some bodyweight squats. That there's always a bit of time if you are hungry enough, if you want it badly enough. However, what I would say is if someone goes, look, I only have this amount of time and these are all booked up for these sessions, I would honestly consider dropping an easy session in your training week for a strength session. Now, to some of you that might be heresy. Why on earth would I sacrifice time that I could be running, or could be on the bike, or could be in the pool for strength training? Well, because that sort of chances are that gentle, easy session that you're doing, it will make you 0.01% aerobically fitter. And by stacking these sessions, this is how we get faster. And that's great. It really is important to keep those sessions in. But would you not be better if you could say, if we did this strength and conditioning session, if we keep this up for a year, we could take a couple of minutes off of your 5k time? Don't get me wrong, I'm not making that promise. But if that was the deal, if somebody came along and offered you a red pill or a blue pill, strength sessions or no strength sessions, but the strength sessions where we take 2 minutes off your 5k PB, I think we'd all go for that pill. Obviously, it is not as simple and clear cut as that, but you do have to zoom out and you do have to think about it like that and go, look, I do need to think about the long game rather than instant gratification and just going for as much as I can as soon as I can. The second concern that people have, often women, is that they don't want to get big and muscular by going to the gym. And it's hard for me to explain just how I understand the concern, but just how misguided it is from a a scientific perspective. I've heard bodybuilders who have said, look, those who come across and say we don't want to accidentally end up like you. Again, it's almost an insult to the hard work that bodybuilder has done with their nutrition, with their training, with the thousands of hours of grind and the watching their nutrition incredibly carefully. That a triathlete is worried that if they do a few press-ups that they might start looking like them. The amount of stimulus it takes to grow muscle, the calorific surplus that you probably need to be in to grow muscle. Again, we will get a little bit toned up from our swimming, cycling and running training, as well as our strength training, but we're not going to start looking really big and really bulky unless we do a very focused program, working within a relatively narrow set of reps with specific, there is so much that goes into building muscle, because guess what? The body doesn't want to grow muscle. Muscle requires calories to maintain, muscle requires protein to maintain, and the body will only really build it if it feels it absolutely has to. A bodybuilder might be there grinding out bicep curls, but for all the body knows, it's wrestling with a saber-toothed tiger. And it's going, look, if we're going to win this fight, we need to get bigger muscles. The body is really, really adamant that it does not want to build any more muscle than absolutely necessary. The next objection that people have is they say, well, my favourite athlete doesn't do it. Now, it could be that they don't do it. It could be that they vocally say, I don't believe in it, I don't bother with it. Chances are, they probably do it even if they don't talk about it, even if they don't stick it on Instagram, either because it's not that interesting, or they want to maybe keep it to themselves a little bit for whatever reason. But let's look at the difference, okay? So if, for the sake of argument, the average triathlete is a man in his 40s, I believe, sort of 45 to 50. So if you are a male, 45 to 50, and you spent, the last 30 years sat behind a desk working in an insurance company, and you decide that you want to take on triathlon, and you start training and you look at what it is that a 22-year-old is doing in their training, and you go, oh, well, my training needs to look like theirs, and they're not doing strength work. I mean, do you really think that athlete that you're comparing yourself to, do you really think you come from the same place as them? Especially when you consider that athlete in their early 20s has probably been, at the very least, swimming and running since they're about 5 or 6. And they've been moving daily ever since then, and they are now one of the highest performers in the sport. Even if they are genuinely and publicly saying, I don't bother with strength training, do you think that could be because they're so young that they can get away with it? I think there's a good possibility that might be. And if we were to go back 10 years ago, I'd say that probably, I remember, reading articles soon after I started coaching about how different athletes believe that strength training is their secret weapon that helps them to win this event, this championship. And the lens has now shifted, where if an athlete doesn't do strength work, that's more of a news story than an athlete doing strength work. And as a part of my British Triathlon Level 3 course, I actually had the pleasure of being sat next to a Olympic triathlete, and she was saying that she didn't do any strength training in her exercise, and I was in the process of training as a strength coach, and I was paired. We also sat next to someone who was a qualified strength coach at the time. And we were chatting to her about it, and I noticed that, sort of a year or go later, she's now posting about strength work in her training. Now, I'm not saying that, I'm definitely not taking the credit, the fact that me and the other chap were talking to her about it. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But from knowing that somebody doesn't do any strength work to then seeing somebody, I mean, she had been in the sport for 14 years at that point, to somebody sort of starting to integrate strength work into their training after that time, it suggests, I guess sort of the importance of it as she started to get through her career. I think she's she must be in her mid-30s now, about the same age as me. It is the changes not only to her as an individual and her body as an athlete as she ages, but also just the approach that different professional athletes are making. And yes, you could use Google to find a professional athlete that doesn't strength train. That's something known as confirmation bias, where we go out of our way to find some information that aligns with our belief system. Another common complaint is that triathletes just find it boring. And you know what? I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I'm not going to say that it is the world's most exciting thing to do. Look, none of us started this sport to spend hours grinding away in a gym. We started the sport to ride our bikes, to be swimming in lakes, to be running around trails. I'm not going to suggest that strength training holds a flame to that. But strength training is what allows you to be able to continue enjoying the fun stuff for several years, rather than, sort of being constantly on and off injured. So I really would recommend that you see it through sort of a larger lens, but also, if you really track your progress with strength training, if you have a plan that, that evolves and changes, not too much, because we do need to make sure that we are practicing the same exercises, repeating them to an extent so we can get better at them. But as long as there's more variety in those strength plans, I think, it can be a perfectly engaging experience. But generally speaking, a exercise, a session, whatever it is, it's more engaging to somebody if they understand why it is that they're doing it in the first place. If they're just doing it because their coach told them this was the thing to do, they're not going to be engaged, they're not going to be motivated in the same way. Probably, one of the biggest complaints I hear about strength training is it has too much of an impact on my swimming, my cycling and my running. And you know what, I get it. If you start strength training when you're in the build-up for a race because you're looking for everything you can do to prepare for that race, and you hit the gym without really much of a plan, or you hop in with very little in the way of sort of literacy or understanding of the gym, then you are going to be sore the next day. You are going to be walking around like John Wayne doing a John Wayne impression. And you did this one strength session, and you then had to take 3 or 4 days off of running whilst you recover from that, and probably like a rest day the day after because you were so beaten up. You can understand people going, hang on a minute, this sucks. Like, how is this going to make me faster if it's going to affect my ability to train? Now, a lot of triathletes experience DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, when they go hard in a session and approach it with the same reckless abandon they might cycling. They go, oh, I'm going to go really hard, I'm going to push myself to the max to make sure I get the most out of this session. Ways that you can reduce delayed onset muscle soreness, well, have a bit more of a warm-up. Generally speaking, the more that somebody warms up instead of jumping straight onto the heavy challenging weights, that will reduce the DOMS that they experience. The biggest way to reduce soreness that you have the next day, it's just to do more strength training. And this sucks. I'm not gonna dress it up otherwise, but this is why this time of year, when most of us are coming to the off season, this is the time to do the strength training. Because if you do a sensible strength training set, okay, if you don't go in hard, if you do some sensible strength training, but you still wake up the next day, you're feeling a bit sore and tight, okay, you might still be able to get a gentle swim in. But you are not going to find yourself unable to train for several days. And even if you were, for some reason, then it doesn't actually make that much of an impact on the times you'll be putting in to your races next spring and next summer. This is the time to invest in strength training. This is the time to kind of get your body used to lifting weights, to target those muscles that you've forgotten that you had. You ever wake up the day after doing an exercise or a session and think, oh, I'm hurting in places I didn't even know I had. It goes back to that neuromuscular activation piece we were talking about earlier in the episode. But it also means that we are doing really good things, that we are asking our body to use use its muscles it's not really used to. It wakes them up, it gets them moving, get that out of the way nice and early. So that by the time that we get deeper into the base phase, by the time that we get sort of around, like most people around January, February, is when they'll start, if they have races coming up in sort of June, July, is when they go, right, okay, time to get serious, time to really knuckle down, time to work hard. Then we can hit our strength training and we can knock out 1 or 2 days a week in the gym and not really feel it much the next day. So as we start to increase our longer rides and our longer runs, our strength training, it just becomes another session during the week that we don't really feel a huge amount the next day, but we are still getting the benefits of. Don't be drawn into thinking there's this real correlation between how sore you are the next day and how good your workout was. So that's it. That is, most of the benefits of strength and conditioning. There are bits that I haven't covered here. However, I don't feel that they're really worth me discussing on a forum like this. If I was among other coaches, it might be a little bit different. If I'm speaking sort of general athletes, I think that what I've covered today is probably more than enough. In next week's episode, I'm going to be looking at sort of what I call the nuts and bolts of strength and conditioning. So this could be looking at different bits of equipment. This is going to be choosing a gym, looking at sets, reps, rest times. I'm going to be talking you through this as if you've never stepped foot in a gym before. Okay? And you know what? You don't even need a gym to get started with strength and conditioning. You can do it just with body weight. Now, you wouldn't be able to achieve quite the same results just training just with body weight than you would with weights, but that doesn't mean that it won't be more than challenging for you given where you are in your triathlon journey right now. If you are feeling weak, if you've never really done any strength training, don't feel that you need to go and spend big money on a gym to get stronger. There's a lot we can do training from home. Now, I hope this podcast has got some of you at least fired up, enthused, and excited to go, you know what, this is the time to really actually commit to strength training this year. This is where I really want to set myself up for success, to reduce the amount of injuries that I get and improve my performance next season with strength training. Yep, that's exactly what I think we all want, isn't it? So, what I have written is back in the spring, in anticipation for this time of year, I put together a course called Introduction to Strength and Conditioning for Triathlon. And as I've said, it really is built from the ground up around triathletes, and it assumes that you have no experience with strength training. I've got over 50 videos in there, which it includes me demonstrating exercises with coaching points, progressions, regressions, how it makes us a faster triathlete. As well as 9 12-week training plans to choose from, 3 of which are body weight, 3 of which are using basic home equipment such as dumbbells and kettlebells, and 3 of which assume that you're in a gym and you have access to all the equipment you'd have in a gym. Each level of those has novice, experienced and advanced programs as well, depending on the level of triathlete you are, but all of them are based on the assumption you've never done any strength work before. There's also a huge module on triathlon anatomy, where we talk about all the muscles that we target with these exercises, common injuries in those areas, how they influence our performance. There is just a huge amount of information in there. It took me several months of hard work to put together. And for the duration of the next month, so taking you up until early November 2025, I am offering you 25% off of this course, because I want people to strength train, and I do believe, well, I would, wouldn't I, that my course is the perfect entry point to this. So you will find a discount code down in the show notes for 25% off. However, if you are listening to this after the offer has expired, I'm still going to give you a 10% discount code off of that course to soften the blow a little bit. Okay? So head down into the show notes, take a look at the course, and pick up your copy today. Wishing you the very best of luck with your training. I'll see you all next week, where I will be covering this in a bit more detail and we can actually get ourselves started with our strength training.